When I'm in touch with myself as a spiritual being rather than my name, my physical form, my external identity, the profession that I have, my designation, etc., in that spiritual consciousness of being that being within, I'm in touch with my own conscience. My conscience is awake and alert and is able to give me guidance. And for most people today, it's very difficult to hear the very quiet voice of the conscience speak inside, maybe because they don't give it enough time. Because you need to let your mind become quiet, otherwise the mind is like the chattering monkey that's on and on and on. And of course, all the things that we're surrounded with, all our devices are adding to that non-stop flow of information. And there isn't a moment just to stop and be still and ask myself the question, should I not? And because we're missing out on that, then we get pulled into whatever becomes the social norm. And you can see how from a society generally that had morals and values, there was a downward slide to a society where maybe people didn't bother too much about morals, and maybe they knew what they were doing was wrong, but they still carried on doing it. So you get to the state of immorality. But then you get to a state of amorality, which is quite normal nowadays, where people will say, oh, don't even talk about morals anymore. So amorality, where morals don't have an influence on human life and policies and the way in which things are going. And so definitely the moral compass, the conscience, awakens through silence, through spirituality, knowing myself. And that's also the guideline that gives me the principles on which I work within my field of expertise, my profession, the policies we create. You see some of the debates that go on in the world, and there's a long list of them. And we're not really looking at the values that are innate to human beings. And so we're going totally against that in so many different situations, whether maybe it's the issue of racism, maybe it's all sorts of things like this that we're having to deal with. But ethics and values are connected with the spirit within, and spirituality means exploring my own being within. And so yes, definitely spirituality allows the awakening of the conscience, the moral compass, and to allow ethics to come back into our lives and public life also. I can't remember that when I was young there was so much fear around. As a 9-year-old child, my mother would let me run to the corner shop in London, and she'd put a £1 note in my hand and give me a list of things to get, and I'd run, and the shopkeeper would give me a big smile and give me whatever it was on that list, and then he'd make sure I was holding the change very tightly in my hand so that it didn't drop out, and I'd run back again. I cannot imagine a mother being able to say to a 9-year-old girl anymore, or a boy, doesn't matter, run down to the corner shop and get this for me. That little illustration just gives me an indication of how society has changed. And there is so much fear constantly, continually, in every situation in life. For example, I know that in London again, when I was growing up, I didn't feel that there was any racial barriers. And then there came a moment when there was a massive influx of people of color from Africa. They were coming in because of a political situation in that country, and so it was Asians who came to London, a big number, and people became very afraid. They were afraid of the immigrants, and the immigrants were afraid of them. And it was a general situation that came up. And so there's a lot of fear on both sides. People who perpetrate violence, but also people who are the victims of violence. And that's not a healthy society. If your actions are going to be fear-based, what happened to love? What happened to being able to see my neighbor and loving my neighbor? And so I see that you can't legislate for these things. Most countries do have some sort of anti-discrimination laws in place, but to what extent can you change people's hearts and minds through laws? I don't think you can. But when people begin to understand something, then there's a shift. And I know for myself, having been in situations where there was racial discrimination, I was lucky. I was already on a spiritual path when I was faced with this. And so once I had to face this, I had to ask myself the question, what's going on inside of me? Am I going to react and run, or am I going to leave the country? What am I going to do? And the first thought that came was that, well, I can't expect the other to change. If I wait for others to change, I don't know how long that's going to take. What I can do is come back to the inner being and get in touch with my own inner core values and have respect for myself and have that inner dignity in which no one outside can take that dignity away from me. And so I found that the spiritual answer was very useful in a situation which is not in one country, but in most countries across the world. There's all sorts of discrimination that exists. Another aspect of that would be bullying. Not just children in the school playground, but even maybe at work, maybe even in politics. We've seen examples of that also. And so given all of this, again, the answer for me is going back deep within myself and holding my head up high on the basis of knowing who I truly am. Whenever there's a revolution that happens within society, it's never that it starts with a majority. It'll start with 1, 10, 100 enlightened individuals, and that will bring about a transformation. And then at some point of time, the minority view reaches a critical mass and it becomes a view that's now recognized by the majority. That's how the slave trade was abolished. That's how smoking in public places has finished in many countries. So we've had indicators of this. And so here again, if people who are being victimized, who are the target of discrimination, if individuals begin to respond differently, and instead of reacting with anger or sorrow or any other negative response, if they're able to hold their own inner dignity, I think there's a very strong message that's being sent out, and I think situations change. It was like Mandela. He didn't tell the people in South Africa to react with anger. He told people to react with forgiveness. And one man was able to shift the consciousness of a nation and at that time avert the tragedy of a civil war. I was in South Africa a lot in those days, and so I saw the shift happen. And so I'm very convinced that when there's a shift within one individual, it doesn't stay restricted to one. It impacts their family, their community, and it's able to spread out further and further. And so I think that yes, there can be a shift. Aware of myself, I can feel the light that I am, the child of the Supreme. My parent is the being of light. And in the awareness of my parent, I too am light. I, the inner being, the soul, am a being of peace, a being of light. God shares the light of peace with all of us. And peace radiates out into this world. Touched by God's peace, the memory returns. This is how I used to be. This is my original state of being. This is who I truly am. God's light of peace removes the darkness of the world and brings about the day.